The radio crackled with static and disbelief. "Repeat your last, Warthog 6-1. Did you say pilot down?" General Morrison's voice cut through the command bunker like a blade through silk. The operations center at Bagram Air Base fell silent except for the persistent hum of monitors displaying red dots scattered across the Afghan mountains. Captain Rivera leaned closer to her console, her fingers dancing across keys that might as well have been playing a funeral dirge. "Confirmed, sir. Warthog 6-1 went dark approximately 14 minutes ago. Last known position grid November Victor 7742. Rivera's voice carried the weight of delivering news no one wanted to hear. The pilot was Kazimiera Ghost Novik, a name that had become legend in these mountains long before anyone bothered to learn how to pronounce it correctly. Ghost had a reputation for making the impossible look routine, for threading her A-10 Thunderbolt through valleys that existed only in the fever dreams of tactical planners. Morrison studied the tactical display, his weathered face illuminated by the amber glow of coordinates that spelled out disaster. The mountains of Kunar province stretched across the screen like broken teeth, each peak a tombstone for aircraft that had dared to fly too low, too bold, too close to the edge of what physics and prayer could accomplish together. Ghost's last known position sat in a valley that intelligence had marked as a hornet's nest of Taliban fighters, a place where rescue helicopters went to become statistics. "What's her story, Rivera?" Morrison asked, though he already knew pieces of it. Ghost Novik wasn't just another pilot. She was the pilot who'd earned her call sign not for stealth, but for her uncanny ability to appear exactly where the enemy least expected her, then vanish like smoke before they could react. 3 tour, 47 confirmed kills, and a reputation for bringing home aircraft that should have been scattered across mountainsides weeks ago. Rivera pulled up the file, though she could recite it from memory. Captain Kazimiera Novik, 28 years old, originally from Detroit. Father was a mechanic, mother was a nurse. She's been flying the A-10 for 6 years, specialized in close air support in contested zones. Her squadron calls her Ghost because... Rivera paused, glancing at the general who was still staring at that red dot on the screen. "Because she never stays dead," Morrison finished quietly. He'd heard the stories, the whispered conversations in mess halls about how Ghost could nurse a dying aircraft home on prayers and aviation fuel, how she'd once landed an A-10 with 3 feet of its left wing missing, and still managed to taxi to the maintenance hangar under its own power. But every ghost story has an ending, and looking at that motionless red dot nestled between peaks that scraped the belly of heaven itself, Morrison couldn't shake the feeling that today might be the day Kazimiera Novik finally stayed dead. The silence stretched until it became unbearable, broken only by the steady pulse of radar sweeps that found nothing but mountains, clouds, and the growing certainty that they were starring at coordinates that marked more than just a crash site. They were looking at the place where legends went to die, where the sky finally collected its debt from those who dared to own it. Captain Marcus Webb had been monitoring radio frequencies for 12 years, and he knew the difference between routine chatter and the kind of silence that preceded either miracles or memorial services. His headset crackled with the standard background noise of military communications, position reports, weather updates, fuel status checks. But underlying it all was a tension that made his jaw clench involuntarily. Ghost Novik was down somewhere in those mountains, and every pilot in the theater knew that when Ghost went quiet, it usually meant someone was about to have a very bad day. Webb adjusted his headset and leaned back in his chair at the communications hub, watching his scope paint pictures of an increasingly complicated situation. 3 search and rescue helicopters were spinning up on the tarmac, their crews running through pre-flight checks with the kind of mechanical precision that came from knowing they might not be coming home. The weather forecast showed deteriorating conditions moving in from the west, and the intelligence reports suggested that every Taliban fighter within 50 miles was converging on the crash site like antibodies responding to an infection. Overlord, this is Dustoff 77, requesting immediate clearance for search and rescue operation, came the voice of Major Patricia Hendricks, the lead rescue pilot whose reputation for pulling people out of impossible situations was almost as legendary as Ghost's reputation for getting into them. Webb had worked with Hendricks before. She was the kind of pilot who treated physics as a suggestion rather than a law, and she'd need every bit of that attitude for what lay ahead. Dustoff 77, Overlord. Be advised, target area is heavily contested. Enemy activity reported within 2 clicks of crash coordinates, weather deteriorating rapidly. Webb's fingers moved across his console, pulling up satellite imagery that showed cloud cover building like a gray wall across the mountain peaks. Current ceiling dropping to Angels 15 and falling. The pause that followed carried weight. Webb could picture Hendricks in her cockpit, studying the same weather data, calculating the odds of threading a rescue helicopter through mountain passes that were about to disappear into clouds thick enough to hide the hand of God himself. These were the moments when training gave way to something deeper, when the decision to launch came down to the simple question of whether you could live with yourself if you didn't try. Overlord Dustoff 77, we're going anyway. Hendricks' voice carried the flat certainty of someone who'd already made peace with whatever consequences lay ahead. Ghost pulled my squad out of a hot zone in Helmand last year when nobody else would fly. Time to return the favor. Webb watched his scope as 3 helicopters lifted off in formation, their rotors beating the air into submission as they climbed toward mountains that looked like they'd been designed by someone with a grudge against aviation. The tactical frequency came alive with position reports and navigation updates, the kind of professional chatter that barely concealed the fact that everyone involved knew they were flying into a situation where the margin for error had been reduced to something approaching zero. As the rescue formation disappeared into the distance, Webb found himself thinking about Ghost Novak and the stories that had made her famous throughout the command. There was the time she'd spent 27 minutes in a hover, providing cover for a ground unit that was pinned down by heavy machine gun fire, her aircraft taking hits that should have brought her down but somehow didn't. Or the mission where she'd flown so low through a valley that her wingtips scraped stone, all to deliver precision strikes that allowed a convoy to escape an ambush. But every story had a final chapter, and as Webb monitored the radio frequencies for any sign of her survival beacon, he couldn't escape the growing certainty that they were about to learn how this particular legend would end. The A-10 Thunderbolt II, serial number 790142, had been built in 1979 by Fairchild Republic, back when the Cold War was still cold, and the idea of close air support meant flying low enough to count the rivets on Soviet armor. She was one of the last of her kind, a relic from an era when aircraft were designed around their weapons rather than the other way around. Her official call sign was Warthog 61, but everyone who knew her simply called her Demon, after the artwork that adorned her nose, a grinning skull with wings that had been painted there by her first pilot and touched up by every crew chief since. Demon had seen 3 wars, absorbed more battle damage than most aircraft see in their entire service lives, and somehow kept flying through combinations of mechanical stubbornness, and what maintenance crews swore was pure spite. Her airframe showed the scars of 2 decades of combat, patches welded over shrapnel holes, paint worn thin by sand and heat, hydraulic lines that had been rerouted so many times they looked like the circulatory system of something that had evolved in hell itself. Ghost Novak had been flying Demon for 18 months, and in that time they'd developed the kind of partnership that transcended the normal relationship between pilot and machine. She knew every vibration, every sound, every subtle change in the way Demon responded to her touch. Ghost could tell when one of the General Electric TF-34 turbofans was running slightly rough, could feel through the stick when the hydraulics were compensating for battle damage, could sense through some combination of instinct and experience when her aircraft was operating at the ragged edge of its design limits. Today, that edge was about to become a cliff. Ghost had been providing close air support for a ground unit that had walked into an ambush in the Korangal Valley, a stretch of Afghanistan that had earned the nickname, the Valley of Death, through the simple expedient of killing everyone who tried to hold it. The mission should have been routine: locate the enemy positions, deliver precision strikes with the GAU-8 Avenger cannon, and return to base for debriefing and another pot of the coffee that tasted like it had been filtered through a sock. Instead, she found herself threading Demon through a narrow canyon at an altitude that would have made a crop duster nervous, trying to deliver ordnance accurate enough to help the ground team without turning them into statistics. The Taliban fighters had positioned themselves well, using the terrain to create overlapping fields of fire that turned the valley floor into a killing ground where movement meant death and staying still meant a slower version of the same thing. Ghost had made 3 passes when the surface-to-air missile rose from the valley floor like a guided lightning bolt, its contrail scribing a line between earth and sky that spelled out disaster in white smoke. She saw it coming, pulled Demon into a turn so sharp that the G-forces tried to squeeze the consciousness from her brain, but physics had already written the conclusion to this particular equation. The missile detonated close enough to turn her world into thunder and fire, close enough to remind her that all the skill in the world couldn't change the fact that she was flying a 40-year-old aircraft through airspace that belonged to people who wanted her dead. The explosion shredded Demon's left engine, sent shrapnel through hydraulic lines and electrical systems, and turned her cockpit into a light show of warning indicators and alarms that screamed about failures cascading through every system that kept her alive. Ghost felt the aircraft shudder like a wounded animal, felt the stick go mushy in her hands as control surfaces stopped responding, felt the horizon tilt in ways that suggested gravity was about to collect on 4 decades of deferred payments. The first thing Ghost noticed wasn't the pain, though that would come later with the persistence of an unwelcome relative. It was the silence. Demon's engines had gone quiet, leaving only the whisper of wind across damaged metal and the distant sound of something electrical shorting out in rhythmic sparks. Her headset crackled with static, and through it she could hear voices calling her call sign with increasing urgency, as if repetition could somehow reach across the miles and pull her back from whatever edge she'd just gone over. Warthog 6-1, Overlord. Radio check over. The voice belonged to someone she didn't recognize, probably a communications specialist back at Bagram who was staring at a scope that showed her aircraft as a motionless blip, surrounded by terrain that didn't leave much room for optimism. Ghost tried to key her mic, but her left arm wasn't responding properly, and when she looked down she could see why. A piece of shrapnel had opened a gash that ran from her elbow to her wrist, painting her flight suit in shades of red that hadn't been part of the original color scheme. Her instrument panel looked like a Christmas tree designed by someone with a grudge against aviation. Warning lights flickered in patterns that told the story of an aircraft that was dying by degrees, each system failure cascading into others in a cascade that would have been fascinating to study if she weren't trapped inside it. Both engines were out, hydraulics were failing, and her electrical system was running on battery power that wouldn't last long enough to finish this thought. But Demon wasn't dead yet, and neither was she. Ghost could feel the aircraft responding to her controls, sluggish and wounded but still flying through some combination of momentum and determination that couldn't be quantified in any engineering manual. She had altitude, she had airspeed, and somewhere below her was terrain that might be soft enough to survive hitting, assuming she could find it before the mountains found her first. Overlord Warthog 6-1. Her voice came out rougher than she'd intended, and she could taste blood when she spoke. I'm hit and losing altitude. Both engines out, hydraulics failing. I'm looking for somewhere to put this thing down. The understatement would have been funny under different circumstances. She wasn't looking for somewhere to land. She was looking for somewhere to crash that wouldn't turn her into a statistic. Copy, Warthog 6-1. Can you make it back to base? The question came from someone who either didn't understand her situation or was hopping that optimism could override physics. Ghost glanced at her altimeter and did the math. She was 15,000 feet above sea level and falling at a rate that would have her on the ground in less than 10 minutes, ready or not. Negative, Overlord. I'm going down somewhere in the Kunar province. Send the cavalry. She looked out her canopy at mountains that stretched to the horizon like the backbone of the world, all rock and snow, and places where aircraft went to become spare parts scattered across landscapes that hadn't changed since God was young. The valley she was gliding toward showed signs of cultivation, terraced fields that suggested water and therefore people, which meant she might survive the landing only to die of other causes entirely. Ghost began running through her emergency checklist, the procedures she'd memorized and practiced but never expected to use in combat. Fuel system, off. Electrical systems, secured. Ejection seat, armed but not yet fired, because she knew that ejecting over Afghanistan was often just a slower way to die, and Demon deserved better than to be abandoned in her final moments. Besides, there was something about the way the aircraft was handling, some stubborn quality in the way she responded to control inputs, that suggested this particular war machine wasn't quite ready to surrender to gravity and enemy fire. Major Patricia Hendricks had been flying rescue missions for 8 years, and she'd learned to read terrain the way a cardiologist read EKGs, looking for the subtle signs that meant the difference between life and death. From her position in the lead A-60 Black Hawk, the mountains of Kunar province spread below like a geological autopsy, all exposed stone and vertical relief that hadn't been designed with helicopter operations in mind. Her crew chief, Sergeant Torres, was scanning the landscape through binoculars that he adjusted with the mechanical precision of someone who knew that a single overlooked detail could turn a rescue mission into a recovery operation. Dustoff 77, this is Overlord. Latest intel puts Ghost approximately 2 miles north of your current position. Be advised, enemy activity reported in the area. Multiple heat signatures moving toward crash coordinates. The voice belonged to someone sitting in an air-conditioned command center, who could deliver bad news without having to breathe the thin air of 10,000 feet altitude or worry about surface-to-air missiles that might rise from the valley floor like deadly flowers blooming in fast motion. Hendricks acknowledged the transmission while her mind processed the tactical situation. Ghost Novik was down somewhere in terrain that would challenge a mountain goat, surrounded by people who considered shooting down aircraft to be a recreational activity, and the weather was deteriorating with the kind of methodical persistence that turned challenging rescues into impossible ones. The mission profile fell somewhere between difficult and suicidal, which put it squarely in the wheelhouse of operations that defined her career. Tours, you seeing anything that looks like wreckage? She banked the helicopter into a turn that followed the contours of a ridge line, staying low enough to avoid radar detection, but high enough to maintain some margin for error if the ground suddenly decided to rise up and introduce itself to her rotor disc. The Black Hawk handled like a truck with wings, but it was a reliable truck that had carried her through 3 combat tours and dozens of missions that shouldn't have ended with everyone coming home alive. Negative on wreckage, ma'am, but I'm seeing some disturbed ground about half a click to the northeast. Could be an impact site, could be natural erosion. Hard to tell from this angle. Torres had the kind of vision that came from spending too many hours scanning hostile terrain for signs of friendly forces, and his assessment carried the weight of experience earned in places where a wrong guess could mean the difference between rescue and revenge. The radio crackled with an unexpected transmission. Dustoff 77, this is Warthog 61. I'm alive and approximately 300 meters south of the wreckage. I say again, I'm alive but injured. Aircraft is a total loss. Ghost's voice came through with the kind of controlled calm that spoke of someone who was hurt but functional, scared but not panicked, alive but aware that the situation could change with very little notice. Hendricks felt something unclench in her chest. Ghost was alive, conscious, and coherent enough to provide accurate position reports. The mission had just shifted from recovery to rescue, which improved the odds considerably and gave everyone involved a reason to push harder against the margins of safety that kept helicopters and their crews operational rather than scattered across mountainsides. Copy, Warthog 6-1. We have your transmission and are proceeding to your position. What's your condition? Hendricks was already adjusting her approach, looking for terrain that would allow her to get the Black Hawk close enough to extract Ghost without turning the rescue helicopter into another crash site. The valley floor showed signs of cultivation, which meant it was probably level enough for a helicopter landing, assuming the locals didn't object to uninvited aircraft using their farmland as a helipad. I'm mobile but bleeding from multiple lacerations. Left arm is probably fractured. Demon kept me alive all the way down, but she's done flying. Ghost's voice carried an undertone of grief that spoke to the bond between pilot and aircraft, the kind of relationship that developed when your survival depended on 20,000 pounds of metal and composite materials that somehow kept defying gravity long enough to bring you home. Ghost Novik had crawled away from the wreckage of Demon, with the slow, methodical movements of someone who understood that haste and carelessness were luxury items she couldn't afford. The A-10 had come down in what could generously be called a controlled crash, carving a furrow through a terraced field that would probably be visible from orbit. She'd managed to keep the aircraft level during the final approach, bleeding off airspeed until Demon settled onto the earth with the resigned grace of something that had finally decided to stop fighting gravity. The impact had been hard enough to rattle every filling in her head and compress her spine by what felt like several inches, but she was alive and mostly functional, which put her ahead of the statistical curve for uncontrolled landings in hostile territory. Her left arm was definitely broken. Her ribs felt like someone had used them for drum practice, and there was blood running down her face from a cut that had opened when her helmet hit the instrument panel. But these were the kind of problems that could be solved with time and medical attention, assuming she lived long enough to receive medical attention. Ghost had managed to extract herself from Demon's cockpit and crawl approximately 200 meters from the wreckage before the first curious locals arrived. They were farmers mostly, men with weathered faces and careful eyes who approached the crashed aircraft with the wariness of people who had learned that unfamiliar objects falling from the sky were usually followed by other unfamiliar objects that exploded. They spoke in rapid Pashto, pointing at the wreckage and then at her, and while she couldn't understand the words, the tone suggested they were having a spirited discussion about what to do with an injured American pilot who had just turned their barley field into a crash site. The debate ended when someone pointed toward the ridgeline where armed figures were making their way down the slope with the purposeful movement of people who had business to conduct and schedules to keep. Ghost recognized the tactical formation even at a distance. Taliban fighters moving to secure the crash site and capture or kill any survivors they found. Her emergency radio was dead, probably damaged in the crash, which meant she was on her own until the rescue helicopters arrived, assuming they could find her and assuming they arrived before her welcome committee did. She found cover behind a low stone wall that separated one terrace from another, using her good arm to check her sidearm and the contents of her survival kit. The 9 Beretta had survived the crash intact, and she had 2 spare magazines plus whatever was already loaded. Her first aid kit contained the usual collection of bandages and antiseptic that might keep her functional long enough to make a difference, and her survival radio had a locator beacon that was probably transmitting her position to anyone equipped to receive it. The sound of helicopter rotors reached her before she saw the aircraft, the distinctive whop-whop-whop of rotor blades chopping through thin mountain air. The Black Hawks appeared over the ridgeline like mechanical angels, flying in a formation that spoke of pilots who knew their business and weren't particularly concerned about what might be waiting for them on the ground. Ghost keyed her survival radio, hoping the transmission would reach them before the Taliban fighters reached her. Dustoff 77, this is Ghost. I'm behind the stone wall approximately 100 meters south of the wreckage. I have company coming down the ridge, armed and unfriendly. Recommend immediate extraction. She could see muzzle flashes from the approaching fighters, sporadic gunfire that suggested they were more interested in establishing their presence than achieving accuracy, at least for the moment. Copy, Ghost. We see you and we see them. Keep your head down, we're coming in hot. The rescue helicopter banked into an approach that would bring it directly over her position, and Ghost could see door gunners preparing to provide covering fire that would discourage anyone from interfering with the extraction. Sergeant Torres had seen enough combat to recognize the difference between harassment fire and concentrated efforts to kill people, and what was coming up from the ridgeline fell distinctly into the latter category. The Taliban fighters had spread into a loose skirmish line that allowed them to bring multiple weapons to bear on the landing zone, while making it difficult for the door gunners to engage them all simultaneously. These weren't farmers with old rifles. They were experienced fighters who understood small unit tactics and had come prepared to turn the rescue operation into a very expensive lesson about the dangers of flying helicopters into contested airspace. Ma'am, we've got at least 8 shooters on the ridge, maybe more moving up from the valley floor. They're setting up overlapping fields of fire that'll turn the LZ into a killing ground if we try a standard approach. Torres had his M240 machine gun positioned to provide suppressing fire, but he knew that 3 helicopters and their door guns would be facing a numerically superior force that held the high ground and knew the terrain intimately. Major Hendricks was already adjusting her approach, using the natural contours of the valley to mask their movement, while her mind calculated angles and distances with the kind of tactical geometry that separated successful rescue pilots from statistics. The Black Hawk shuddered as rounds impacted the fuselage. Nothing critical yet, but enough to remind everyone aboard that they were flying into a situation where people were actively trying to kill them. Dustoff 7879, this is 77. We're taking fire from multiple positions. I need you to suppress the ridge line while I extract Ghost. Focus on the muzzle flashes along the tree line. She could see Ghost's position behind the stone wall, a small figure in a flight suit who represented not just a pilot to be rescued, but a legend whose survival had become a matter of professional pride for everyone involved in the operation. The second and third helicopters peeled off to provide covering fire, their door gunners opening up with a sustained barrage that sent streams of tracer rounds walking across the ridgeline like deadly fireflies. The return fire intensified, and Torres could hear rounds snapping past the open door with the kind of angry buzz that meant they were missing by inches rather than feet. One round sparked off the helicopter's external fuel tank, and he found himself wondering whether aviation fuel and enemy bullets were about to provide an impromptu demonstration of cause and effect. Ghost, this is Dustoff 77. We're coming in for immediate extraction. When you see us touch down, run to the aircraft and don't stop running until you're inside. Hendricks was bringing the Black Hawk in fast and low, using the terrain features to mask their approach until the last possible moment. The helicopter flared hard as it settled toward the terraced field, and Torres could see Ghost rising from her position behind the stone wall, moving with the awkward gait of someone who was injured but determined not to let physics or enemy fire prevent her from reaching safety. Muzzle flashes erupted from positions along the ridge as the Taliban fighters realized what was happening, and the air filled with the metallic whine of bullets searching for targets. Torres returned fire with his M240, sending controlled bursts toward the largest concentrations of enemy shooters while trying to provide cover for Ghost's dash across open ground. She was moving as fast as her injuries allowed, but 50 meters of exposed terrain suddenly seemed like 50 miles when people were shooting at you from elevated positions. A rocket-propelled grenade streaked across the valley floor, missing the helicopter by close enough to feel the heat wash across the cabin. Torres could see more fighters moving down from the ridge, and he realized that what had started as a rescue operation was rapidly turning into a full-scale engagement with enemy forces that had them outnumbered and outgunned. 30 seconds, Ghost. Keep moving. Hendricks held the helicopter in a hover that put every ounce of her skill against the combined effects of thin air, enemy fire, and an aircraft that was starting to show the effects of battle damage. Ghost covered the final 20 meters to the helicopter at a dead run that her broken ribs and fractured arm loudly objected to. But adrenaline and the prospect of continued survival provided excellent motivation for ignoring minor details like pain and physical limitations. Bullets snapped through the air around her with increasing frequency as the Taliban fighters adjusted their aim, and she could see muzzle flashes from positions that seemed to surround the landing zone on 3 sides. The Black Hawk sat in the middle of it all like a mechanical island of salvation, its rotor wash whipping dust and debris into a blinding cloud that provided some concealment, but made running in a straight line an exercise in faith and determination. Sergeant Torres was laying down suppressing fire with his M240, sending streams of tracer rounds toward the ridge line in patterns that were designed more to discourage accurate shooting than to achieve precise target engagement. The other 2 helicopters were providing covering fire from offset positions, their door gunners working to suppress enemy positions without hitting the rescue helicopter or its passenger, who was currently sprinting across open ground while people shot at her. She reached the helicopter's cabin and threw herself inside with the graceless urgency of someone who understood that staying upright was less important than staying alive. Torres grabbed her good arm and hauled her deeper into the aircraft, while Hendricks pulled power and lifted the Black Hawk away from the landing zone in a climbing turn that put several tons of mountain between them and the shooters who were still trying to turn their rescue mission into a memorial service. "I'm in. Go, go, go." Ghost found herself pressed against the cabin floor as the helicopter accelerated away from the valley, the G-forces combining with her injuries to remind her that being rescued was only marginally less traumatic than being shot down. She could hear rounds impacting the aircraft's fuselage, metallic thuds that spoke of enemy fire following them, even as they gained altitude and distance from the immediate threat. Torres was already working on her injuries with the kind of efficient field medicine that came from too much practice treating combat casualties in the back of helicopters. Her left arm was definitely fractured, probably in 2 places, and the laceration on her forearm would need stitches that could wait until they reached a proper medical facility. The cut on her forehead was bleeding freely but wasn't life-threatening, and her ribs were probably cracked but not displaced enough to puncture anything vital. "How you feeling, Ghost?" Torres had to shout over the noise of the rotors and the wind rushing through the open doors. The helicopter was climbing toward safer altitude, but they were still within range of shoulder-fired surface-to-air missiles, and everyone aboard knew that the mission wouldn't be complete until they reached friendly airspace. "Like I just crashed an airplane and then got shot at by people who don't appreciate American foreign policy." Ghost managed what might have been a smile if it hadn't been interrupted by a wince as Torres applied antiseptic to her forearm. "But I'm alive, which puts me ahead of where I was 20 minutes ago. How's Demon?" "Total loss, ma'am. She scattered across about 200 meters of Afghan farmland. But she kept you alive all the way down, which is more than most aircraft could manage after taking that kind of battle damage." Torres had seen the wreckage from the air-twisted metal that had once been one of the most effective close air support aircraft ever built, now reduced to spare parts and scrap metal that would probably be scavenged by locals who had more practical concerns than preserving aviation history. Ghost nodded, and Torres could see something that might have been grief cross her face before she pushed it aside in favor of more immediate concerns. The bond between pilot and aircraft was something that civilians didn't understand, a relationship that went beyond the mechanical into something that resembled partnership or even friendship. Losing an aircraft wasn't just losing a machine. It was losing a companion that had shared dangers and victories, that had responded to her touch and brought her home when bringing her home seemed impossible. The radio crackled with transmissions from the other helicopters in the formation, position reports and fuel status updates that indicated the rescue operation was proceeding according to plan. Back at Bagram Air Base, General Morrison stood in the operations center watching the tactical display that showed 3 green dots moving steadily away from the crash site toward friendly airspace. The rescue operation had succeeded, but the cost was still being calculated. One A-10 aircraft destroyed, millions of dollars in taxpayer investment scattered across a valley that most Americans couldn't find on a map. More importantly, they'd nearly lost Ghost Novik, a pilot whose value couldn't be measured in dollars or replacement costs, but in the lives she'd saved, and the missions she'd completed when other pilots might have turned back or called for backup. Captain Rivera looked up from her communications console with the expression of someone who had been monitoring radio frequencies for the past hour and was finally allowing herself to believe that everyone was coming home alive. "Sir, Dustoff 77 reports successful extraction. Ghost is injured but stable. ETA to base is 45 minutes. The relief in her voice was unprofessional and completely understandable. In the close-knit community of combat aviation, losing a pilot like Ghost would have rippled through the entire theater of operations. Morrison nodded, but his expression remained grim. Ghost was alive and en route to medical treatment, but the larger implications of the day's events were still playing out in his mind. The A-10 Thunderbolt II was an aging aircraft, designed during the Cold War for a different kind of conflict against a different kind of enemy. Every mission flown in Afghanistan pushed these aircraft closer to the margins of their operational limits, and eventually, those margins would prove insufficient for the demands being placed on them and their pilots. "Rivera, get me a full after-action report. I want to know everything that went wrong today, and I want recommendations for preventing it from happening again." Morrison had been in command long enough to know that successful rescues didn't eliminate the need for hard questions about operational procedures and risk management. Ghost had survived today through a combination of skill, luck, and the stubborn engineering of an aircraft that had been built to absorb battle damage and keep flying. But luck was a finite resource, and even the best engineering had limits that could be exceeded by enemy action or mechanical failure. The operations center resumed its normal rhythm of routine communications and status updates, but Morrison could sense an underlying tension that came from knowing that what had happened to Ghost could happen to any pilot flying close air support missions in contested airspace. The enemy was adaptive, learning from each engagement and developing new tactics for dealing with American air power. Surface-to-air missiles were becoming more sophisticated, more accurate, and more readily available to forces that had every reason to want American aircraft out of their skis. Morrison pulled up Ghost's personnel file on his tablet, scanning through commendations and mission reports that told the story of an exceptional pilot who had consistently performed beyond the call of duty. 3 tours of combat duty, 47 confirmed kills, dozens of close air support missions that had saved the lives of ground troops who might otherwise have been overwhelmed by enemy forces. She'd earned her reputation through competence and courage, but reputation alone wouldn't protect her from the next surface-to-air missile or the mechanical failure that could turn any routine mission into a life-threatening emergency. The general made a decision that would ripple through the chain of command and eventually reach pilot briefing rooms throughout the theater. "Rivera, draft a message to all squadron commanders. Effective immediately, no single aircraft missions in contested airspace. All close air support operations will be conducted with a minimum of 2 aircraft, and pilots will maintain constant communication with AWACS controllers." It was the kind of operational change that would be unpopular with pilots who prized their independence and tactical flexibility. But Morrison had learned that dead heroes were less useful than live pilots who could fight again another day. Dr. Sarah Chen had been treating combat casualties for 6 years, and she'd learned to read the subtle signs that distinguished between patients who would recover completely and those who would carry the physical and psychological scars of their service for the rest of their lives. Captain Kazimiera Novik lay on the examination table in the base medical facility, her injuries cleaned and dressed, but her eyes carrying the thousand-yard stare that came from surviving something that should have killed her. The physical damage was straightforward enough to assess and treat. Fractured ulna and radius in the left arm, 3 cracked ribs, multiple lacerations from shrapnel, and a concussion that was probably mild but would require observation for the next 24 hours. These were the kind of injuries that would heal with time and proper medical care, leaving scars that would serve as permanent reminders of the day she'd walked away from an aircraft crash in enemy territory. But Chen had seen enough combat trauma to recognize that the physical injuries were often the least significant in the long term. Ghost stared at the ceiling with the kind of intensity that suggested she was seeing something other than acoustic tiles and fluorescent lighting, probably replaying the sequence of events that had led to her aircraft being destroyed, and her survival being measured in minutes and meters, rather than the comfortable margins that most people took for granted. "How are you feeling, Captain?" Chen kept her voice gentle, professional, but not clinical. Ghost had been through enough medical examinations to recognize the difference between a doctor who saw patients as problems to be solved and one who understood that treating combat injuries required attention to more than just the physical symptoms. "Like I just crashed an A-10 and lived to tell about it." Ghost's voice was steady, but Chen could hear the underlying tension that spoke of someone who was maintaining control through willpower and training rather than genuine calm. "My aircraft is scattered across half of Afghanistan, but I'm alive and mostly functional."